The wind howled across the plateau, a savage roar scraping through bone and hope alike. Snow lashed sideways, sharp as glass, swallowing the earth in white silence. Ruth Caldwell pushed forward, her shawls frozen stiff, clinging to the small body pressed against her chest. Her 5-year-old son, Will, burned with fever that mocked the cold. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. Hours had passed since he last spoke. His head lay limp against her shoulder, his weight heavier than fear. Each step sank her deeper into the snow. Her boots filled with ice. Her legs trembled from exhaustion and terror, not just fatigue. She whispered to the boy against the storm's roar, begging him to hold on, though her lips were cracked and bloodied. There was no road, no tree, no landmark, just endless white stretching into oblivion. The silence of death was drawing close. Her knees buckled. She fell hard, twisting to shield Will from the impact. The snow bit her skin. A copper taste filled her mouth. She tried to rise, but her limbs no longer obeyed. Lying there, she clutched her son tighter, tears freezing before they reached her chin. The sobs were not loud or desperate, just the soft sound of surrender when there is nothing left to fight for. Then came a sound against the wind. Hoofbeats, faint at first, then stronger. She lifted her head weakly, the world spinning. Through the storm, a dark figure appeared on horseback, moving with purpose. The rider stopped just feet away, dismounted, and strode toward her. Ruth tried to speak, her voice raw and small, begging the stranger to save her child, even if he meant her harm. The man knelt beside her, his face sharp and calm beneath a hood lined with fur. His eyes were dark, reflecting the storm's firelight. His coat was thick leather, dusted with frost. He said nothing cruel, made no move for his knife. Instead, he studied the child with quiet concern. He placed a hand on Will's burning forehead, frowned, and rose quickly. His whistle cut through the wind, calling his horse closer. Ruth tried to protest. She told him to take the boy and leave her, that she could not go farther. But he ignored her words. With strength and ease, he lifted the child into his arms, mounted, and then reached down for her. For a long breath, she hesitated. Then she took his hand. The world swayed as he pulled her onto the saddle behind him. The cold bit into her face as they rode, yet she no longer felt its sting. She pressed her cheek to Will's head and listened to the rhythm of hooves beating against the frozen earth. They rode through the storm until the sun was gone and the world was swallowed by night. When they finally stopped, they were sheltered by a cave carved into the hillside. The man lifted Will down gently, carried him inside, and returned to help Ruth, who could barely stand. Inside, a fire burned low, crackling softly. Blankets and herbs rested near a kettle as though waiting for them. He wrapped the child in a thick hide and poured something dark and bitter between his lips. Will stirred faintly, and Ruth's tears blurred her vision. When the boy began to breathe evenly, the man stirred the fire. His name, he told her, was Teneba. He was Navajo. She should have feared him. Everything she'd been taught told her to. But as the warmth spread through the cave, fear lost its grip. He had no reason to help her, yet he had. When she asked him why, his answer was simple. Mercy did not care about color. That night, for the first time in days, Ruth closed her eyes beside the fire and slept. Her son was alive. Her fate was now tied to the stranger who had carried her through the storm. When Ruth awoke, the air was dim and golden. The wind outside had quieted, the storm's fury now a distant murmur. Warmth radiated through the firs beneath her. The scent of pine smoke lingered. Her body felt like borrowed weight, alive but fragile. Panic struck first. She turned quickly, searching. Then she saw Will near the fire, bundled in buffalo hide, cheeks flushed pink. His chest rose and fell softly. He was breathing. Relief broke over her like sunlight. She pressed her hands to her mouth, silent tears sliding down her face. But her gaze soon found the man again. Teneba sat near the fire, grinding herbs in a stone bowl. His movements were steady, deliberate. He looked carved from the very rock that surrounded them. Strong, silent, impossible to read. The leather cords around his wrists were worn smooth from years of work. Ruth's pulse quickened. Her instinct, old and ingrained, urged her to distrust him. But the sight of her sleeping son steadied her heart. She asked where they were. He did not answer at first, simply poured the crushed herbs into the pot and stirred. When she pressed again, her voice trembled with defiance. He turned toward her and said only that he had brought her here to keep her alive. Anger flared. She insisted she hadn't asked for his help, that she owed him nothing. He did not reply, only placed a steaming cup beside her. She told him to stay back, to stop pretending charity. His expression did not change. He reminded her her child lived, and that was enough. The words stung more than comforted. Her pride, her fear, everything she'd built to survive alone began to crumble. She wanted to hate him for being right. She wanted to stand, to leave, to prove she could. But she couldn't. The truth was too heavy. If not for him, Will would have been buried beneath the snow. And so she stayed silent, staring at the fire until her eyes burned. By morning, the boy stirred. Ruth sat upright at once, her heart leaping as he whispered her name. His voice was faint but real. She touched his face warm again and kissed his forehead. Teneba sat beyond the light, sharpening a blade, not watching but listening. Ruth looked at him through her tears, unsure whether gratitude or unease filled her chest. She introduced herself quietly, and when he gave his name again, she told him it was beautiful. For a moment the silence between them softened. The air in the cave felt less like a prison, more like a fragile truce. She watched him through the flicker of firelight and realized his stillness wasn't indifference. It was patience. When their eyes met, she saw something that startled her. Understanding. Not comfort, not invitation, but something steady and human. It was the first time in years she had been looked at without judgment or pity. For the first time, the space between them held more than fear. By the fourth morning, the storm had cleared. The world outside glittered under a pale sun, pure and silent. Ruth stepped from the cave, the cold air biting at her cheeks, alive and sharp. Teneba was tending his horse nearby. She told him she was going back, to Fort Briar, to the life she knew. She said there were people who would be worried, but Teneba warned her quietly that those people would not welcome her return. She bristled, insisting he was wrong. He was not. He told her she would not be believed. They would not accept that a Navajo man had saved her life. They would invent their own truth, one steeped in shame. She argued that she didn't care what they said, but he looked at her with quiet certainty. They would not whisper, they would shout. They would ask what she had given him for her son's life. His words struck like stones. She called him arrogant, but he did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke of a girl he had once saved, a settler who lost her family in the wilderness. He carried her back to town, but they branded him a murderer. They hunted him, beat him, nearly killed him. The girl stayed silent to survive. His scars were older than her fear. Ruth said nothing. The story carved something open inside her. The distance between their worlds, once so wide, suddenly felt unbearably small. When she looked at her son, she understood what Teneba had risked, not just for them, but for himself. Returning meant losing everything. The road back to the life she once knew no longer existed. Before she could decide what to do next, the sound of snow crunching behind her broke the calm. 4 men emerged from the trees, trappers from Fort Briar. Their rifles glinted in the light. Ruth's heart dropped. They called to her, voices dripping with mockery, accusing her of lying with a savage. When one of them reached for her son, something in Teneba ignited. He dropped the firewood and moved like the storm itself, fast, unrelenting. The snow erupted into violence. He fought without hesitation, precise and merciless, until the men lay defeated. The others dragged their wounded companion away, leaving silence behind. Ruth stood trembling, Will clinging to her leg. When she looked at Teneba, her fear was gone. What she saw instead was the force of his restraint, the strength it took to protect without destroying. When their eyes met, something passed between them that had nothing to do with gratitude. It was trust, unspoken, whole. They fled through the frozen plains until their horses staggered from exhaustion. The horizon was endless, pale and empty. Behind them lay danger and blood. Ahead, only the unknown. Teneba led them to a hollow beneath a great cottonwood near a frozen stream. The cold pressed deep into their bones, cruel and clean. Ruth sat beside Will, holding him close, whispering through chattering teeth. When Teneba built a small fire, the glow flickered like a heartbeat against the snow. Without a word, he removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. She tried to refuse, but he did not listen. He sat near the fire, eyes scanning the dark, a silent guardian. Ruth clutched the coat, breathing in the faint scent of smoke and pine. The warmth spread through her slowly, painfully, like remembering something she thought she'd lost. She watched him through the firelight, his profile calm, unyielding. After a long silence, she asked why he had saved them. His answer came like a whisper carried by the wind, because once someone hadn't saved him. When he was a boy, he'd been wounded and left to die. His uncle had begged settlers for help. They had turned away, saying they were not worth the cost of a bullet or a drop of water. That night, his uncle buried himself in snow to keep him warm and never woke again. The story hollowed her. Her throat tightened with something that was not pity but recognition. He told her that living meant carrying silence for those you could have saved. He didn't want to carry that silence anymore. Ruth reached for his hand, her pale fingers resting against his weathered skin. It was not an act of repayment, it was understanding. She told him she hadn't trusted anyone for years, but tonight she did. He looked at her then, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "You are brave," his gaze seemed to say. They sat side by side in the firelight, the snow whispering beyond them. Her shoulder brushed his and he did not move away. Days later, the trail led them through red canyons where the snow thinned and the wind carried the scent of stone and sage. Ruth rode silently, her mind a tangle of gratitude and fear. When the first Navajo dwellings appeared, low huts carved from earth and timber, her breath caught. It felt like stepping into a world untouched by everything she once knew. The people watched as they entered, wary, quiet, their eyes speaking what their lips did not. But when Will reached down and took Taneba's hand, the tension eased. The boy's small fingers bridged the distance between worlds. An elder met them, his hair silver, his robe lined with buffalo hide. He studied Ruth for a long time before giving a slow nod. That night, they were offered a small shelter at the village edge. The firelight flickered across their faces as silence settled. Ruth sat by the flames, hands resting in her lap, watching Taneba sharpen his blade. His quiet no longer frightened her. It felt like peace. She spoke softly, admitting she didn't know what it meant to love someone so different from herself. Yet every time she saw him care for her child, she felt herself learning. Taneba said nothing, only drew from his satchel a piece of carved turquoise and placed it around her neck. The stone was cool against her skin. His hand lingered near her cheek for a moment, long enough for her to understand. It was not a vow. It was an invitation. Spring came late but sure. The snow melted, and Ruth became part of the rhythm of the village. She worked, learned, and was no longer a stranger. Will ran through the fields laughing, following Taneba like a shadow. When the boy called him Dad one night, Ruth's heart settled like a river meeting its course. Later, she sat sewing by the fire, stitching red thread into a white scarf. It would be for the life they had built, though no one had named it yet. When Taneba returned, dusty from the trail, he sat beside her. She told him she had once died in the snow, ready to disappear. But love had lifted her onto a horse into a new life and never put her down again. He took her hand, and silence answered for both of them. There were no vows spoken, no promises declared. Only the steady sound of fire and breath, the rhythm of two hearts that had found home in the space between worlds.